July 1957. Vito Genovese put a gun to Harlem's head and demanded 50% of Bumpy Johnson's blood money. 3 months later, he sat alone in a Bronx diner. No soldiers, no iron, watching Bumpy walk in with murder in his eyes. When you spit in a killer's face, you don't get to choose how you die. April 1957. The back room of Reggio's on Mulberry Street smelled like cigar smoke and old blood. Not the fresh kind, the kind that seeps into wood and never washes out. The kind that reminds men what happens when negotiations fail. Bumpy Johnson sat across from Vito Genovese at a table that had seen better men die over worse insults. No guns on the table. That was the rule. But everyone in that room knew rules were just agreements waiting to be broken by whoever had the stones to break them first. Genovese leaned back, his chair creaking like a gallows rope. He didn't look at Bumpy when he spoke. That was the first insult, the one that said you're not worth eye contact. "Harlem's been good to you," Genovese said, rolling a thick Cuban between his fingers. "Real good. Policy banks, numbers, protection. You built something up there." Bumpy didn't move, didn't blink. Men who survived in his world knew that silence was a weapon sharper than any blade. "Thing is," Genovese continued, lighting the cigar with a gold Zippo that probably cost more than most Harlem families made in a year. "You built it on our streets, our city, our permission." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Bumpy's lieutenant stood behind him, 3 men who'd killed for him, bled for him, would die for him. But this wasn't their play. This was chess. And the board had just been flipped. "I've paid tribute," Bumpy said. His voice was Detroit steel cold, hard, unbreakable. "Same percentage, same terms, for 15 years. "Yeah," Genovese exhaled smoke like a dragon counting its gold. "And we appreciate that. We really do. But times change. Costs go up. Harlem's worth more than it used to be, which means you're worth more than you used to be. The word you're hung in the air like a noose. So here's how it's gonna work from now on." Genovese finally looked at him. Dead shark eyes. No warmth. No humanity. Just calculation. New arrangement. New terms. Non-negotiable. Bumpy's face could have been carved from granite. "You listening?" Genovese asked. "I'm listening." "Good, because I'm only saying this once." He tapped ash onto the floor, another insult, deliberate as a slap. "From here on out, nothing moves in Harlem without our approval. No policy slips, no protection rackets, no dice games in basement clubs, nothing. You want to breathe up there. You ask permission first." One of Bumpy's men shifted his weight. The floorboard creaked. Genovese's soldiers tensed, hands drifting toward jacket pockets where iron waited hungry. "Easy," Bumpy said quietly. His man froze. Genovese smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd just watched another man swallow his pride and found the taste entertaining. "Smart," Genovese said. "I knew you were smart. That's why we're having this conversation instead of reading about you in tomorrow's papers." The threat wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. "You've done good work up in Harlem," Genovese continued. "Real good, and we want you to keep doing it. But the economics have changed. The world's changed, and men who don't change with it." He shrugged. "Well, they stop being men and start being memories." Bumpy's jaw tightened. It was the only tell he gave. "So here's the new deal," Genovese said, leaning forward now, close enough that Bumpy could smell the garlic and violence on his breath. "You keep running things up there. You keep the streets quiet. You keep the money flowing. But the split changes." He paused. Let the silence build. Let the room fill with dread. 50%. The words landed like a body hitting concrete from 10 stories up. 50% of everything, Genovese repeated. Gross, not net. And we'll be sending people to verify the count, just to make sure there's no misunderstandings. Bumpy didn't speak. Couldn't speak. Because speaking meant accepting. And accepting meant surrendering. And surrendering meant dying in every way that mattered except the one that put you in the ground. Nothing to say, Genovese asked. I'm disappointed. I thought you'd have more fight in you. Bumpy stood up slowly. His men tensed. Genovese's soldiers reached for their pieces. Meeting over? Genovese asked. Meeting's over. Bumpy said, Good. Then we understand each other. Bumpy walked toward the door. Each step was an eternity. Each breath was swallowing razor blades. Behind him, Genovese's voice followed like a curse. Oh, and Bumpy, first payments due Monday. Don't be late. The door closed. The rules had changed. And in that room where power was measured in humiliation instead of bullets. Bumpy Johnson learned that sometimes the most violent thing a man can do is make you live with your shame. The number sat in Bumpy's gut like a tumor. 50%. Not 30. Not 40. 50. Half of everything he'd built. Half of every dollar that came through Harlem. Half of every drop of sweat. Every broken bone. Every night he'd spent turning a neighborhood into an empire. Gone. Just like that. Because Vito Genovese said so. Bumpy sat in his Lenox Avenue office, a room above a butcher shop, where the smell of blood was permanent and appropriate. His lieutenants stood around him like pallbearers at a funeral for something that hadn't died yet but would soon. We going to war? Asked Raymond, a scarred bull of a man who'd killed his first-mate guy at 16. No, Bumpy said. Then what? We're going to think. Thinking. In a world where most problems were solved with a .45 and a shallow grave. Thinking was revolutionary. Dangerous. Maybe suicidal. They're taking half, said Marcus, the numbers man. The one who understood that money was just blood converted into paper. Half. Bumpy. That's not tribute. That's ownership. I know what it is. Do you? Marcus's voice had an edge sharp enough to draw blood. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like we just got colonized. Like Harlem just became a plantation, and we're the ones picking cotton for Italian landlords. Bumpy's hand moved fast, not to a gun, but to the whiskey bottle on his desk. He poured 3 fingers of bourbon that cost more than most men's weekly wages, drank it in one swallow, felt it burn going down like swallowed pride. Language changed, he said finally. What at the meeting? Genovese's language. Used to be cooperation. Used to be mutual benefit. Used to be, we help each other out. He poured another drink. Now it's our streets. Our city. Our permission. So what? Raymond growled. Words don't mean shit when they're backed by guns. Words mean everything when they're backed by guns, Bumpy corrected. Because words tell you how a man thinks, and how a man thinks tells you how he dies. The room went quiet. When Bumpy talked about death, men listened. Genovese thinks he owns Harlem now, Bumpy continued. Thinks we're tenants. Thinks 50% makes us employees instead of partners. We ain't partners, Marcus said bitterly. We're hostages. For now. For now. Raymond's face twisted. Bumpy, they're bleeding us dry. 50% means we can't pay our people, can't expand, can't even maintain what we got in 6 months. We'll be running on fumes. In a year. We'll be extinct. Maybe. Marcus slammed his hand on the desk. There's no maybe here, the math doesn't lie. 50% is a death sentence disguised as a handshake. Bumpy looked at him with eyes that had seen more death than most men could imagine and said, Then maybe we need to make them regret the handshake. The temperature shifted. How? Raymond asked quietly. They want 50% fine. We'll give them 50%. Of what? Of exactly what they're worth to us. Bumpy's smile was a knife in the dark. Right now, they provide protection, political connections, safety from other families. That's worth something. Maybe 20%. Maybe 25%. But 50-50 means they're not protecting us anymore, they're robbing us. And robbing us means they've broken the contract. And broken contracts mean all bets are off. Marcus leaned forward. You're talking about cutting them out. I'm talking about making them understand the difference between tribute and theft. They'll kill you, Raymond said flatly. They'll kill all of us. Maybe. Or maybe they'll realize that killing us costs more than keeping us alive. Bumpy stood up, walked to the window, looked down at Lenox Avenue where people moved like blood through veins, unaware that the heart pumping them was about to stop. Genovese thinks power is taking what you want. I'm about to teach him that power is making them afraid to take it in the first place. How? Bumpy turned back to face them. In the dim light of the office, he looked like a prophet or a demon, hard to tell which. We slow down, he said. What, we slow everything down? Policy banks take longer to process bets. Collections get delayed. Numbers runners get sick. Money that used to flow like a river starts moving like molasses in January. Genovese wants 50%. He's going to have to work for every penny. And while he's working for it, he's going to realize that taking half of something broken is worse than taking a quarter of something that runs smooth. Raymond's eyes widened. You're going to tank our own operation. I'm going to make our operation expensive for the wrong people. That's insane. No, Bumpy said quietly. Insane is letting a man humiliate you and doing nothing about it. Insane is accepting slavery and calling it business. What I'm doing. He smiled again, that terrible, beautiful smile that made men remember why they followed him into hell. What I'm doing is reminding Vito Genovese that you can own a man's money, but you can't own his will. And when a man's will decides to fight back, money becomes the least valuable thing in the room. He picked up the whiskey bottle, raised it like a toast to absent enemies. 50%, he said. They wanted 50%, so let's show them what 50% of nothing looks like. Outside, Harlem kept breathing. Inside, war had just been declared without a single shot fired. Bumpy Johnson walked out of Reggio's restaurant at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in April 1957, and every made man on Mulberry Street felt it. Not the walking, the way he walked. No hurry, no fear, no deference. Just a man who'd been told he was owned, stepping into sunlight like he still had the right to exist. Genovese watched from the window upstairs, cigar burning between his teeth like a fuse. He didn't ask permission to leave, said Tommy Bones, Genovese's enforcer, a man who'd broken more bones than a cancer ward. I noticed. Want me to remind him about respect? No. Genovese's voice was ice over deep water. Let him walk. Let them all see him walk. Because when he comes back crawling, the lesson will be that much sweeter. But Bumpy didn't crawl, didn't look back, just climbed into his Cadillac where Raymond and Marcus waited, their faces tight as drum skins. Drive, Bumpy said. Raymond drove. They didn't speak until they crossed the Harlem River, until the geography itself put distance between them and the men who thought they owned distance. That was a suicide mission, Marcus said finally. Walking out like that, no apology, no submission. You might as well have spit in his face. Maybe I did, Bumpy said, watching the city blur past. Just not with saliva. They're going to come for us. Maybe. Maybe. Raymond's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Bumpy, we just told the most dangerous man in New York to go fuck himself. There's no maybe about the consequences. There's always maybe, Bumpy said quietly, because consequences depend on who's defining them. Genovese thinks consequences mean violence. I'm about to teach him they mean economics. The Cadillac pulled up to the usual spot outside the Red Rooster, where Harlem's pulse could be taken by who was drinking, what with whom. Bumpy got out, stood on the sidewalk, let himself be seen. Within minutes, the word spread like wildfire through tenements and churches, through barbershops and speakeasies, through every corner where Harlem's blood flowed. Bumpy met with the Italians. They demanded half. He walked out standing. That last part mattered more than anything else. Standing. Not bowing. Not begging. Standing. By nightfall. Every policy runner, every numbers banker, every street lieutenant in Harlem knew what had happened, knew the tribute had doubled, knew the rules had changed. But they also knew Bumpy hadn't broken. "You understand what you just did?" asked Stephanie St. Clair, the queen of numbers, sitting in her usual booth at the Rooster. Counting money that represented more than dollars, it represented independence in a world that hated independent black women with successful businesses. "I walked out of a meeting," Bumpy said, sliding into the seat across from her. "You walked out of a lynching." Her eyes were sharp enough to cut glass. "Genovese doesn't make offers. He makes pronouncements. And pronouncements don't end with "you're dismissed." They end with "you're dismissed and grateful to be alive." I wasn't grateful. Obviously. She lit a cigarette, exhaled smoke that smelled like defiance. "So what now?" "Something quieter." "There's nothing quiet about 50%. Bumpy. That's robbery. That's colonization. That's them telling us we're sharecroppers on our own land." "I know what it is." "Then why'd you walk out instead of putting a bullet in his skull?" Bumpy leaned back, let the question hang in the air between them like a challenge, waiting to be accepted. "Because bullets are loud," he said finally, "and loud brings attention, brings federal agents, brings investigations, brings the kind of heat that burns everyone, not just the man you're trying to kill. So what we just accepted, just bend over and let them." "We make it expensive," Bumpy interrupted. "We make every dollar they take cost them $2 in problems. We make their tribute so painful to collect that they start wondering if the money's worth the migraine." Stephanie studied him through cigarette smoke, her mind calculating angles faster than any adding machine. "You're going to slow everything down," she said. It wasn't a question. "Everything. They'll notice. I'm counting on it. And when they come asking why their money's late," Bumpy's smile was a razor in the dark, "we'll tell them the truth. That 50% costs more to extract than 25%. That doubling the tribute halves the efficiency. That greed has operating costs they didn't factor into their mathematics. That's not how they think. Then maybe it's time they learned." Outside the Red Rooster, Harlem kept moving, people dancing, drinking, loving, fighting, surviving. But underneath the music and the laughter, something had shifted. A line had been drawn, not in blood, not yet, but in dignity, in refusal, in the simple act of walking out of a room where powerful men expected submission and choosing to stand instead of kneel. By morning, the story had grown teeth. Bumpy Johnson looked Vito Genovese in the eye and didn't blink. Looked at 50% and didn't break. Walked out of Mulberry Street like he owned it instead of owed it. True or not, the story mattered more than the facts. Because in Harlem, stories were how power was measured, how reputations were built, how revolutions started, And Bumpy Johnson had just told a story that made men remember what it meant to fight back without throwing a punch. Somewhere in Little Italy, Vito Genovese poured expensive wine and told his men that Bumpy would break within a month. Somewhere in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson poured cheap whiskey and knew that breaking was a choice, and he'd already chosen otherwise. The war had begun, silent, brutal, inevitable. And the first shot hadn't been a bullet, it had been a man refusing to ask permission to leave a room where he'd never belonged in the first place. The first week after the meeting, Genovese's collectors came to Harlem expecting money. They got excuses instead. "Numbers are down," said Raymond, standing in a counting room that smelled like sweat and desperation. "People ain't betting like they used to." "Bullshit," said Frankie the Fist Lombardi, a collector whose nickname came from what he did to people who lied to him. "Numbers don't just drop. Not in Harlem. Not when welfare checks hit and people got cash burning holes in their pockets. I'm just telling you what the books say." "Then the books are lying." Raymond shrugged a gesture that said, "Take it up with God." "Because I can't help you. You want to call Bumpy a liar, you go ahead. But I'm just the messenger." Frankie stared at the ledger like it had personally insulted his mother. Numbers that should have been in the thousands were in the hundreds. Revenue that should have flowed like a river was trickling like a dying man's pulse. "Where's the rest?" Frankie demanded. "There is no rest. There's always rest. People in Harlem don't stop gambling. They'd bet on cockroaches racing across a kitchen floor if someone gave them odds." "Then maybe the cockroaches are slow this week." Frankie's hand moved toward his jacket. Raymond didn't flinch, didn't reach for his own piece, just stood there like a man who'd already calculated the cost of violence and decided it wasn't worth paying. "You threatening me?" Raymond asked quietly. "I'm reminding you who you work for." "I work for Bumpy Johnson." "You collect from Bumpy Johnson. There's a difference." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Frankie pulled his hand back, not out of fear, out of calculation, because putting a bullet in Raymond's skull would feel good for about 3 seconds, and then it would start a war that would cost more than whatever money was missing from this week's take. "Genovese ain't gonna like this," Frankie said. "Then tell him to come talk to Bumpy about it." "Maybe I will. Make sure you bring flowers," Raymond said. "Bumpy appreciates good manners." Frankie left with half of what he came for, and twice as much rage. Week 2. The pattern repeated. Different collectors. Same story. Numbers down. Revenue soft. Cash flow interrupted by mysterious inefficiencies that nobody could quite explain, but everybody could feel. "Policy slips are getting lost," said Marcus to another collector, this one named Paulie, the Pipe, because he'd once beaten a man to death with a lead pipe for looking at his girlfriend wrong. "Runners are calling in sick. One of our counters got pneumonia. Another got arrested for jaywalking and won't make bail until Friday." Jaywalking. Paulie's face twisted like he'd bitten into rotten meat. "Who the fuck gets arrested for jaywalking in Harlem?" "Apparently our counter did. This is horseshit. File a complaint with the NYPD. I'm sure they'll be very sympathetic." Paulie wanted to break something, wanted to smash Marcus's face into the desk until teeth scattered like dice. But violence was a luxury, and luxuries cost money, and money was exactly what was going missing. "You're playing games," Paulie said. "I'm running a business," Marcus corrected. "And businesses have bad weeks sometimes, especially when new management decides to double the operating costs without increasing the infrastructure." "The fuck does that mean?" "It means 50% doesn't magically make the operation twice as efficient. It makes it half as motivated." Paulie left with even less than Frankie had collected, and the rage he carried back to Little Italy was starting to smell like fear. Week 3. Genovese stopped sending collectors. He sent soldiers instead. Men with guns and reputations. Men who'd killed for less than a short payment. Men who understood that respect was measured in blood and terror. They came to the Red Rooster at midnight, when the music was loud and the liquor was flowing and people were too drunk to remember faces. Bumpy was waiting for them, not hiding, not armed, just sitting at his usual table, drinking bourbon like he didn't have a care in the world. "We got a problem," said Carmine. The snake Persico, a made man whose nickname came from how he moved silent, deadly, impossible to predict. "Do we?" Bumpy asked. "Money's light. 3 weeks running. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. Business is slow. Business is never slow in Harlem. First time for everything." Carmine leaned forward, close enough that Bumpy could smell the garlic and violence on his breath. "You think this is funny? You think you can fuck with Genovese's money and walk away breathing?" "I think," Bumpy said slowly, each word measured like bullets in a chamber, "that your boss changed the terms without changing the infrastructure. And infrastructure takes time to adjust. You want 50% of a smooth operation. You're going to have to accept 25% of a rough one until the system stabilizes. That's not how this works." "Then explain to me how it does work. Because from where I'm sitting, doubling tribute while cutting autonomy is like asking a car to go twice as fast while slashing the tires. Physics doesn't care about your feelings." Carmine's hand drifted toward his jacket. Every man in the Red Rooster tensed. "You pull that gun," Bumpy said quietly, "and you'll get 1 shot. Maybe 2. Then my people will turn you into Swiss cheese and dump your body in the river. And tomorrow, Genovese will have to explain to the commission why he started a war over a cash flow problem that could have been solved with patience. You threatening me?" "I'm educating you. There's a difference." Carmine's jaw clenched. His hand stayed on the jacket. Time stretched like taffy. Finally, he pulled his hand back. Not empty, he'd never pulled it at all. Just moved it away from the weapon that would have made this conversation permanent. "This ain't over," Carmine said. "It never is," Bumpy agreed. "But it also doesn't have to be fatal. Tell Genovese the money's coming, just slower than he'd like. And if he wants it faster, he can come talk to me about realistic expectations versus fantasy mathematics." Carmine left. No bodies hit the floor. No bullets shattered the night. Just a conversation that felt more dangerous than any shooting ever could. Because in that moment, Bumpy Johnson had done something impossible. He'd made Genovese's soldiers walk away without satisfaction, and in the world of organized crime, dissatisfaction was a cancer that spread faster than violence. By May, Harlem moved like a drunk trying to walk a straight line functional. But barely. Policy banks that used to process bets in minutes now took hours. Numbers that used to be called by noon weren't announced until sunset. Money that used to flow like a river now moved like sludge through a clogged pipe. And Genovese's cut, his precious 50%, became harder to calculate than quantum physics. "What the hell is this?" demanded Tommy Bones, standing in Marcus's counting room with a ledger that looked like it had been written by a schizophrenic accountant. "This week's receipts," Marcus said calmly. "These numbers don't make sense. You got bets listed that paid out more than they took in. You got runners claiming tips that eat into profits. You got operating costs that doubled from last month. Inflation. Inflation." Tommy's face turned the color of a heart attack. "In 4 weeks, inflation doesn't work that fast. Tell that to our suppliers. Ink costs more, paper costs more, bribes cost more. Everything costs more when you're trying to extract twice the revenue from the same infrastructure." Tommy grabbed Marcus by the collar, slammed him against the wall hard enough to crack plaster. "You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know you're fucking with the books?" Marcus didn't struggle, didn't fight, just looked Tommy in the eye with the calm of a man who'd already calculated the cost of this violence and decided it was worth paying. "Prove it," Marcus said quietly. "What?" "Prove I'm fucking with the books. Show me where the numbers are wrong. Show me which bets are fake, which expenses are inflated, which runners are lying. Go ahead. I'll wait." Tommy stared at the ledger, stared at Marcus, stared at the impossible mathematics that turned profit into loss and made 50% feel like robbery in reverse. He couldn't prove anything, because the beauty of what Bumpy had done was that it wasn't fraud, it was malicious compliance. Every number was technically accurate. Every expense was technically legitimate. The operation was just running at maximum inefficiency, like an engine deliberately flooded with bad gasoline. Tommy let go. Marcus straightened his collar. "Genovese is going to hear about this," Tommy said. "I hope so." Marcus replied, "Maybe then he'll understand that you can't squeeze blood from a stone. You can try. You can apply pressure, but all you'll get is broken fingers and frustration." The money did come. Eventually. Just not when Genovese wanted it. Not in the amounts he expected. Not with the ease he'd been promised. Every payment was late. Every count was disputed. Every collection turned into a negotiation that felt more like a hostage situation. And slowly, so slowly that it was almost imperceptible, the cost of collecting 50% started to exceed the value of collecting anything at all. Genovese's soldiers spent more time in Harlem than they did in Little Italy. More time arguing with Bumpy's people than collecting from them. More time trying to verify numbers than counting actual cash. It was death by 1,000 cuts. No bullets. No bodies. Just the slow, agonizing realization that conquest wasn't the same as control. "How much did we get this week?" Genovese asked Tommy Bones in early June. Tommy laid out the numbers like a coroner presenting autopsy results. 12,000, he said. Genovese's cigar nearly fell out of his mouth. 12. It should be 50. What the fuck happened to the other 38? Operating costs, late payments, disputed counts. Bumpy's people are claiming everything from sick runners to police interference to acts of God. Acts of God. Genovese's voice could have stripped paint. They're blaming God for short payments, among other things. Genovese stood up, paced the room like a caged animal. This is war. You understand that. This is war without bullets, and we're losing. We're not losing, Tommy said carefully. We're just not winning as much as we thought we would. Same fucking thing. Genovese grabbed the ledger, hurled it across the room. Papers scattered like shot birds. That uppity. He caught himself. Changed tactics. Johnson thinks he can play games with me. Thinks he can slow walk my money and I'll just accept it. What do you want to do? I want to put a bullet in his skull and dump his body in the Harlem River. That would start a war. We're already in a war. A different kind of war. The kind that brings federal attention. The kind that makes the commission ask questions. The kind that costs more than it pays. Genovese slumped back into his chair. Aged 10 years in 10 seconds. Because Tommy was right. And they both knew it. Killing Bumpy would feel good for about 5 minutes. Then it would trigger a bloodbath that would make the Castella Marie's war look like a playground scuffle. Harlem would burn. The NYPD would crack down. The FBI would start asking questions. And at the end of it all, Genovese would control a graveyard instead of a gold mine. So what do we do? Genovese asked quietly. We wait, Tommy said. We collect what we can. And we make Johnson understand that this can't continue forever. And if he doesn't understand, Tommy didn't answer, because they both knew there were only two ways this ended. Either Bumpy broke and accepted his place as a vassal, or Genovese admitted that 50% of a functioning operation was worth less than 25% of one that didn't fight back. Pride versus pragmatism. The oldest war in history. And in Harlem, where every number told a story and every story cost blood. Bumpy Johnson was writing a masterpiece of economic resistance that would have made Gandhi look like an amateur. No guns, no bodies, just mathematics sharp enough to cut bone. Sunday morning, June 9th, 1957. Abyssinian Baptist Church was packed tighter than a slave ship. Reverend Powell stood at the pulpit like an Old Testament prophet, voice booming across pews filled with people who'd come for salvation and stayed for revolution. "I want to talk to you today," Powell said, "about oppression, about exploitation, about men who think they can take what doesn't belong to them simply because they have the power to take it." The congregation murmured. They knew this sermon wasn't about Pharaoh in Egypt. It was about Italians in Manhattan. "There are those," Powell continued, his voice rising like thunder, "who come into our neighborhood with their hands out and their demands ready, who tell us that prosperity has a tax, that success requires permission, that the fruits of our labor belong to men who've never planted a seed in Harlem's soil." "Amen," someone shouted. "They tell us it's business," Powell said. "They tell us it's protection. They tell us it's just the way things work. But I'm here to tell you that theft by any other name still smells like theft. That extortion dressed in a suit is still extortion. That slavery with a contract is still slavery." The church erupted, not in violence, in recognition, because everyone in that room knew exactly who Powell was talking about, knew about the meetings, the demands, the 50% that had turned Harlem's independence into indentured servitude. Powell never said Genovese's name, never mentioned the Italians directly, never gave anyone ammunition for a lawsuit or a reason to call his words slander. But he didn't need to. The congregation understood. And understanding spread like wildfire through a neighborhood that had been waiting for someone to say what everyone already knew. By Monday afternoon, the sermon had been reprinted in the Amsterdam News. By Tuesday, it was being discussed in barbershops and beauty parlors from 110th Street to 155th. By Wednesday, white reporters from downtown papers started asking questions about alleged organized crime influence in Harlem's numbers rackets. And by Thursday, Genovese's operation, which had survived and thrived for decades by operating in shadows, was suddenly bathed in spotlight. "Who the fuck talked to the press?" Genovese demanded, slamming a copy of the New York Times onto his desk hard enough to rattle glasses. "Nobody talked," Tommy Bones said. Powell preached. The papers listened. "Powell works for Bumpy. Powell works for Powell. But he's not blind. He sees what's happening in Harlem. And he's smart enough to know that sunlight is the best disinfectant." Genovese read the article again, his face turning colors that didn't exist in nature. "Sources indicate that certain Italian-American crime families have recently increased their demands on Harlem's underground economy, with some protection payments reportedly doubling in recent months. While specific figures are difficult to verify, business owners and community leaders describe an atmosphere of increasing economic pressure. "This is a disaster," Genovese said. "It's worse than a disaster," Tommy corrected. "It's attention. And attention is poison." Because Tommy was right. The beauty of organized crime was that it operated like a parasite, taking just enough to thrive without killing the host, invisible enough to avoid immune response. But now the immune response was activating. Police who'd been happy to look the other way were suddenly asking questions. Politicians who'd accepted bribes were suddenly demanding investigations. Federal agents who'd been focused on other things were suddenly very interested in interstate commerce violations and tax evasion charges. And all because Bumpy Johnson had turned a private shakedown into a public conversation. "Oh, you did this," Carmine the Snake said, standing in Bumpy's office with murder in his eyes and a newspaper in his hand. Did what Bumpy asked calmly. Got Powell to run his mouth, got the press sniffing around, made our business everybody's business. Powell's his own man. I don't control what he preaches. Bullshit. You put him up to this. Prove it. That word again. Prove it. The two most powerful words in Bumpy's arsenal. Because in a world built on violence and intimidation, proof was the one weapon nobody expected. You're playing with fire, Carmine said. No, Bumpy corrected. I'm playing with visibility. Fire burns. Visibility just makes people see what was always there. And what's always been there is you taking half of everything we built and calling it protection. We are protecting you. From what the only threat to Harlem right now is the threat you represent. You're not our shield. You're our shackles. And shackles don't deserve 50%, they deserve to be broken. Carmine's hand moved toward his gun. Go ahead, Bumpy said quietly. Pull it. Shoot me. Right here in my office where a dozen witnesses can testify that you murdered an unarmed man in cold blood. Give the district attorney exactly what he needs to bring RICO charges against your entire family. Make Genovese explain to the commission why he started a race war over a collection dispute. Carmine's hand stopped. That's what I thought, Bumpy said. Because you're finally starting to understand that visibility changes everything. When we fought in shadows, you had all the power. But now that we're fighting in daylight, every move you make gets scrutinized. Every bullet you fire gets investigated. Every threat you make gets printed in tomorrow's paper. This won't end well for you, Carmine said. Maybe not, Bumpy agreed. But it won't end well for you either. And that's the beauty of visibility. It makes everyone bleed the same color when the law comes calling. Carmine left without another word, and in the silence that followed, Bumpy poured himself a bourbon and considered the battlefield. No guns, no bodies. Just words in a pulpit and ink on a page and the slow, inexorable weight of public opinion turning a private war into a public scandal. Genovese had wanted 50%. What he got was a spotlight bright enough to expose every shadow he'd ever hidden in. And in Harlem, where visibility was power and power was survival, Bumpy Johnson had just weaponized the one thing the mob feared more than bullets: accountability. The commission meeting happened in a basement in Brooklyn where the walls were thick enough to muffle screaming, and the floors were stained with evidence of previous disagreements. Vito Genovese sat at the table like Caesar after Brutus sharpened his knife, still powerful, still dangerous, but suddenly aware that power was a temporary condition. Explain, said Carlo Gambino, a man whose quiet voice carried more weight than most men's shouts. Explain why the Harlem situation is now front-page news in the Times. It's being handled, Genovese said. Handled raw. Frank Costello laughed, a sound like broken glass scraping concrete. The DA is asking questions. The FBI is taking notes. Every cop in Manhattan suddenly remembers he has a badge and a pension to protect. That's not handled. That's a dumpster fire. Johnson is playing games. Johnson is playing you, Costello interrupted, and he's doing it without firing a single shot. You know what that makes him smart. You know what that makes you predictable. Genovese's face turned the color of a bruise. You got something to say to me, Frank. I got a lot to say. Starting with the fact that you went into Harlem swinging your dick around like you were conquering Sicily. 50%. Are you out of your fucking mind? You don't double tribute on a functioning operation. You don't humiliate a man in his own territory and expect him to smile and say thank you. He needed to understand his place. His place Costello leaned forward. His place is running the most profitable numbers operation in Manhattan. His place is keeping Harlem quiet and cooperative and off the FBI's radar. His place is making us money without making us headlines. And you took that place and turned it into a war zone because your ego got bruised at a poker game 3 years ago. The room went silent, because everyone at that table knew what Costello was referring to, a night when Bumpy Johnson had beaten Genovese at cards, and Genovese had been holding that grudge like a loaded gun ever since. "This isn't about ego," Genovese said quietly. "This is about authority, about showing these people that we run this city, not them. Us. Authority doesn't mean shit if it costs more to maintain than it generates," Gambino said. "And from what I'm hearing, your Harlem operation is bleeding money faster than a stuck pig. Collections are down. Costs are up. Your soldiers are spending more time arguing with bookkeepers than collecting tributes. You wanted 50%. What you got is 50% of a headache. It's temporary. Johnson will break." "Will he?" Costello asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, you're the one breaking. Your people are exhausted. Your profits are down. Your reputation is taking hits in newspapers that actually matter. And meanwhile, Johnson is sitting in Harlem like Gandhi with a gun, winning a war without firing a shot." "What do you suggest I do?" Genovese's voice had an edge sharp enough to draw blood. "Back down, reduce the tribute, show weakness. I suggest you stop thinking like a thug and start thinking like a businessman," Gambino said. 25% of a smooth operation is worth more than 50% of a broken one. And right now, you're breaking something that used to make us all rich. Genovese stood up. His chair scraped against concrete like a death rattle. "I'm not backing down," he said. "Then you're a fool," Costello replied. "And fools don't last long in this business." Kutta. The cracks weren't just in the commission. They were in Genovese's own crew. Tommy Bones sat in a bar on Mulberry Street, drinking whiskey that tasted like regret, talking to Frankie the Fist about problems that didn't have solutions. "We're losing money on this," Tommy said quietly. "Every week. We send 4 guys to Harlem. 4 guys who could be collecting from operations that actually pay on time. 4 guys who spend hours arguing with Bumpy's people about numbers that don't add up. You know what that costs. Boss says we can't back down. Boss says a lot of things. Doesn't make them smart." Frankie looked around the bar, making sure nobody was listening. "You saying what I think you're saying. I'm saying this Harlem thing is a money pit. We're spending more to collect than we're collecting. And meanwhile, our other operations are getting ignored because we're too busy fighting a war that doesn't need to be fought. Genovese wants 50%. Genovese wanted a lot of things. Doesn't mean he gets them. Doesn't mean we have to keep bleeding for his pride." "Careful," Frankie said quietly. "That kind of talk gets you disappeared." "So does bankruptcy," Tommy shot back. "And that's where we're headed if we keep this up. You've seen the numbers. You know I'm right." Frankie didn't argue, because he had seen the numbers, had watched profits turn into losses, had watched a simple collection operation turn into a logistical nightmare that consumed resources without producing results. "What do you want to do about it?" Frankie asked. "I want to suggest to the boss that maybe 25% of a functioning operation is better than 50% of a disaster." "He won't listen." "Then maybe we need to make him listen, because this ain't about Bumpy anymore. This is about us, about whether we're soldiers in an army or employees in a failing business." The conversation died there, but the seed was planted, and in the days that followed, that seed grew roots. Other soldiers started asking questions, started calculating costs, started wondering if pride was worth more than profit. Lieutenants started having quiet conversations about realistic expectations versus fantasy mathematics. And slowly, so slowly, that Genovese didn't notice until it was too late, his own people started to turn. Not into traitors, not into enemies, just into men who understood that loyalty had limits, and those limits were measured in dollars and cents. By the end of June, Genovese's authority hadn't collapsed. It had just started to erode. Like a cliff worn down by waves, each crash taking a little more, each retreat leaving less behind. His soldiers still followed orders, but they followed them slower, with more questions, with less enthusiasm. His collections still happened, but they happened with more complaints, more disputes, more recognition that the cost was exceeding the value. And in the dark corners of Little Italy, where power was measured in whispers and respect was calculated in silence, men started to wonder if Vito Genovese couldn't break one black man in Harlem without breaking himself in the process. What did that say about his ability to lead? The question didn't need to be answered, just asked. And in the world of organized crime, questions were more dangerous than bullets, because bullets killed individuals. But questions killed authority, and authority, once questioned, could never quite recover its original weight. Somewhere in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson poured a bourbon and smiled. No guns, no bodies, just the slow, beautiful decay of an empire built on intimidation, learning that intimidation only works when people are afraid. And Harlem had stopped being afraid 3 months ago. July 1957. The restaurant was different this time. Not Reggio's in Little Italy, that was Genovese's territory. His stage, his kingdom where he played God to lesser men. This was a diner in the Bronx, neutral ground, no family colors on the walls, no soldiers lurking in corners, no audience to perform for, just 2 men, a table, and the slow, brutal recognition that power had shifted without a single shot being fired. Bumpy arrived first. Deliberate choice. Sitting when Genovese walked in, sent a message clearer than any gun, and I'm not the one who needs this meeting. Genovese came alone. That was the first surrender, walking into a room without his wolves, without his armor, without the theatrical muscle that usually announced his presence like trumpets before a king. He looked older, thinner, like the last 3 months had aged him in dog years. Johnson, Genovese said, sliding into the booth across from him. Vito, first names. Another shift. No more Mr. Genovese. No more deference. Just 2 men using the names their mothers gave them. Stripped of titles and pretense. We need to talk, Genovese said. I'm listening. Not I'm here to listen. Just I'm listening. The difference was a canyon. Genovese ordered coffee. Black. His hands shook slightly when he lifted the cup, barely noticeable. But Bumpy noticed everything. Noticed the tremor. Noticed the exhaustion around the eyes. Noticed the way a man used to giving orders now had to ask for something as simple as a conversation. This situation, Genovese began, it's become complicated. It has it, you know it has. The papers, the cops asking questions, the fucking FBI taking notes at policy banks like they're writing a doctoral thesis on the numbers racket. Visibility, Bumpy said. It's a bitch. Genovese's jaw clenched. You did that deliberately. Got Powell to preach. Got the press involved. Made our business public. Powell preaches what he wants. I don't control what happens in church. Bullshit. Bumpy shrugged. Believe what you want. But the truth is, all I did was make expensive what you made inevitable. You wanted 50% fine, but 50% comes with 50% more attention, more complexity, more cost. You can't conquer a neighborhood and expect it to stay quiet. Genovese set down his coffee, stared at Bumpy like he was trying to see through flesh to the machinery underneath. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," he said finally. "Most people are. That wasn't a compliment. I know." Silence filled the space between them like smoke from a gun that hadn't been fired yet. "I'm not here to apologize," Genovese said. "I didn't expect you to be, but I'm also not here to keep bleeding. This arrangement, the 50%, it's not working. For either of us." And there it was. The admission. The crack in the armor wide enough to drive a truck through. Bumpy didn't smile, didn't gloat, just waited. Because men who'd spent 3 months drowning didn't need to be pushed. They needed to be given a rope and allowed to grab it. "What are you proposing?" Bumpy asked. "A revision? A recalibration of terms? Speak English. Vito, what do you want?" Genovese took a breath that looked like swallowing glass. 35%. Regular payments. No delays. No creative accounting. Clean business. And in exchange, autonomy. You run Harlem your way. We stay out of operations. You make money. We make money. Nobody bleeds. Nobody goes to prison. Bumpy leaned back. Let the offer hang in the air like a ceasefire proposal in a war neither side could afford to win. 35 is still high, he said. It's fair. Fair would be 20. I can't go to my people with 20. They'd smell blood. Think I went soft. Think you broke me. You're worried about looking weak. Bumpy's voice had an edge like a straight razor. Vito, you sat across from me 3 months ago and demanded half of everything I built. You humiliated me in front of my people. Made me walk out of that room like a sharecropper getting told his rent went up. And now you're worried about looking weak. Genovese's face turned colors that belonged in a medical textbook. I did what I had to do, he said quietly. So did I. And what I had to do was show you that conquest costs more than cooperation. That greed is expensive. That taking half of something broken is worse than taking a quarter of something that works. So what's your number? Bumpy thought about it. Thought about the 3 months of war without bullets. Thought about the slow, grinding satisfaction of watching an empire crack under its own weight. Thought about what vengeance actually looked like when you stripped away the Hollywood bullshit and got down to the mathematics of power. 35, he said finally, but with conditions. What conditions? No soldiers in Harlem unless I approve them. No collections without 24 hours notice. No interference in operations. You get your money. I get my autonomy. And we both pretend this was always the arrangement. That's it. That's it. Genovese studied him, trying to find the trap, the hidden cost, the place where this reasonable offer turned into a knife in the ribs. But there was no trap, because Bumpy had already won. And winners didn't need to rub it in, they just needed to make sure the terms were clear. Deal, Genovese said. They didn't shake hands, didn't toast, didn't perform any of the theatrical rituals that usually sealed agreements between dangerous men. Just nodded, just understood, just accepted that the war was over, and this was how it ended. Not with bodies in the street, not with headlines screaming about mob violence. Just 2 men in a Bronx diner, drinking bad coffee and negotiating a surrender that both sides could pretend was a compromise. Genovese stood to leave, paused at the table. For what it's worth, he said quietly. I underestimated you. I know, Bumpy said. Most people do. That's why they lose. Genovese walked out into afternoon sunlight that felt brighter than it had any right to be. And Bumpy sat alone in the booth, drinking the last of his coffee, thinking about how power worked when you stripped away all the guns and violence and theatrical bullshit. It wasn't about who could kill who. It was about who could afford to keep fighting. And Vito Genovese had just discovered he couldn't afford another month of war with a man who'd turned economics into a weapon sharper than any blade. The meeting was over. The war was over. And for the first time in 3 months, Bumpy Johnson allowed himself to smile. The word spread through Harlem like gospel through a revival tent. 35%. Not 50. Not the crushing, humiliating, sharecropper mathematics that had turned autonomy into vassalage. 35. A number that still hurt but didn't cripple. A tribute that acknowledged power without surrendering dignity. He backed down, Raymond said, standing in Bumpy's office with something approaching religious awe in his voice. Genovese actually backed down. He recalibrated, Bumpy corrected. Men like him don't back down. They just call retreat a strategic repositioning. Same fucking thing. Maybe. But let him keep his illusions. Illusions are cheaper than bullets. Marcus studied the new ledger, the one that reflected 35% instead of 50. The one where numbers started to make sense again, where profit margins weren't razor thin, where breathing room existed between revenue and ruin. This is sustainable, Marcus said quietly. 35 we can live with. 35 means we can pay our people, expand operations, maybe even save for a rainy day. That's the idea. But how'd you get him to agree 3 months ago he was ready to kill you for walking out of a meeting? Now he's cutting the tribute by 15%. What changed? Bumpy poured bourbon, 3 glasses, passed them to Raymond and Marcus like communion wine. What changed, he said, is that Genovese did the math, realized that 50% of a broken operation costs more to collect than it generates, that fighting me was more expensive than paying me. That pride is a luxury, and luxuries require profit, and profit requires peace. So he chose peace. Whoa, he chose solvency. Peace was just the side effect. They drank. The bourbon burned, going down a good burn, the kind that reminded you that you were still alive to feel it. What about the autonomy? Raymond asked. The conditions you mentioned. He actually agreed to stay out of Harlem operations. He did. And you believe him? Bumpy smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd played chess with the devil and walked away with most of his pieces. I believe he believes it right now. Whether he still believes it in 6 months depends on whether we make it profitable for him to keep believing. That's why the 35% matters. It's not just tribute. It's proof of concept. Proof that cooperation pays better than conquest. You're paying him to leave us alone, Marcus said. I'm paying him to remember that leaving us alone is in his best interest. There's a difference. Outside, Harlem moved to its own rhythm. Music from the Red Rooster, laughter from street corners, the sound of a neighborhood that had survived another war and come out standing. So what now? Raymond asked. Now we rebuild. Quietly, carefully. We make sure the 35% flows smooth and steady. No delays. No creative accounting. No games. We prove that this arrangement works better than the last one. And if Genovese tries to change the terms again, then we'll remind him what happened the last time he got greedy. Bumpy's voice went cold, the kind of cold that suggested ice wasn't the absence of heat but the presence of something far more dangerous. We'll remind him that visibility is a weapon, that public attention is poison, that he can push us, but pushing costs more than he's willing to pay. You'd do it again. The whole slowdown operation, the church sermons, the newspaper coverage, in a heartbeat, because now he knows I'm capable of it, and knowledge is deterrence. He won't risk another 3 months of bleeding just to grab an extra 10%. Marcus raised his glass. To 35%, the most expensive discount Vito Genovese ever gave. They drank again. And in that moment, in that office above a Harlem butcher shop where the smell of blood was permanent and appropriate, 3 men celebrated a victory that would never make the history books. No dramatic gunfight, no bodies in the street, no headlines screaming about mob wars. Just a negotiated settlement that looked like compromise but tasted like triumph. Because Bumpy Johnson had done something impossible. He'd made a mob boss blink. Made him calculate cost versus benefit and choose benefit. Made him realize that some men couldn't be conquered, only accommodated. And accommodation, dressed up in the language of business and cooperation and mutual profit, was just another word for respect. The kind of respect that didn't come from fear. The kind that came from recognizing an equal. "One more thing," Bumpy said, setting down his glass. "This stays quiet. No celebrating in the streets. No bragging in the clubs. No stories about how we beat the Italians. We won. But we won quietly. And quiet victories last longer than loud ones." "Why?" Raymond asked. "Because loud victories make enemies want revenge. Quiet victories just make them want to move on. And moving on is exactly what we need them to do." It made sense. Perfect. Brutal sense. They finished their bourbon in silence, and when they walked out of that office, they walked out as men who'd learned that power wasn't about domination. It was about making domination too expensive to attempt. 35%. The number that saved Harlem. The compromise that felt like conquest. The surrender that Vito Genovese would spend the rest of his life pretending was a business decision. 5 years later, 1962. The landscape had changed, but the lesson remained. Vito Genovese sat in federal prison, convicted on narcotics charges that had nothing to do with Harlem and everything to do with the visibility he'd learned to fear too late. Bumpy Johnson sat in the Red Rooster. Older, grayer, still breathing, still powerful, still autonomous, still collecting 35% less than what Genovese had tried to take and calling it victory. "You hear about Vito?" Marcus asked, sliding into the booth with a newspaper that had Genovese's mugshot on the front page. "I heard. 15 years, federal pen. They're saying he'll die in there." "Probably will." Marcus studied Bumpy's face, looking for satisfaction, for triumph, for some sign that this news brought joy. He found nothing but quiet recognition. "You don't seem happy," Marcus said. "Why would I be? Genovese in prison doesn't change anything for us. Doesn't make us richer. Doesn't make us safer. Just makes the Italians reorganize and put some other ambitious psychopath in charge of collections." "But after what he tried to do to you." "He failed," Bumpy interrupted. "That's enough. I don't need him dead or locked up to prove he failed. The proof is sitting right here, drinking bourbon in Harlem, while he's eating prison food in Atlanta." Marcus folded the newspaper, set it aside like yesterday's news, which it was. "The young guys," he said carefully. "The ones who weren't around in '57. They don't understand how you did it, how you beat Genovese without starting a war. I didn't beat him. I made war more expensive than peace. Same thing. Not even close." Bumpy poured 2 glasses, passed one to Marcus. "Beating someone means you destroy them. I didn't destroy Genovese. I just made him recalculate. Made him realize that conquering Harlem cost more than cooperating with Harlem. That's not victory. That's just mathematics with consequences. The young guys don't think in math. They think in bullets. Then they'll die young, or end up like Vito locked in a cage, wondering where it all went wrong." They drank in silence. Outside, Harlem pulsed with life. New generation, new music, new problems that looked different but smelled the same. "You ever regret it?" Marcus asked. "Not fighting back the traditional way. Not putting a bullet in his skull when you had the chance." Bumpy thought about it. Really thought about it. Thought about that first meeting in April '57. The insult, the demand, the humiliation that had burned like acid. Thought about how easy it would have been to kill Genovese, walk into that Bronx diner with a .38 and paint the walls with his brains. Make it quick, make it loud, make it a legend that would have echoed through Harlem for generations. But legends died with the men who made them. Lessons lasted forever. No regrets, Bumpy said finally. Because killing Genovese would have felt good for about 10 seconds. Then it would have started a war that would have burned Harlem to ash. Would have brought federal heat we couldn't survive. Would have turned us from businessmen into fugitives. So you chose business over revenge. I chose survival over satisfaction. There's a difference. Marcus nodded. Understanding. Not agreeing, not completely, but understanding. The tribute, he said. The 35%. We still paying it. Every month. On time. Clean count. And it doesn't bother you. Giving them that much. It bothers me less than giving them 50. Less than giving them everything. Less than being dead or in prison. Bumpy finished his bourbon. Power isn't about taking. It's about keeping. And you can't keep what you can't defend. 35% is the cost of defense. The cost of autonomy. The cost of breathing. That's the expensive breath. Cheaper than not breathing at all. The wisdom landed heavy. True. Undeniable. Because in the 5 years since that Bronx diner meeting, Harlem had thrived. Policy banks expanded. Numbers rackets grew. New businesses opened. Money flowed. Not as much money as it could have without the tribute, but more money than would have flowed if the war had gone hot. You taught us something, Marcus said quietly. That summer in '57. You taught us that violence isn't the only language, that patience is a weapon, that making someone bleed dollars hurts worse than making them bleed blood. And what are you going to do with that lesson? Marcus smiled, the smile of a student who'd learned from a master and was ready to teach the next generation. Pass it on, he said. Teach the young guys that power without a gun lasts longer than power with one, that fear is temporary but respect is permanent, that the men who survive aren't the ones who shoot first, they're the ones who make shooting unnecessary. Bumpy raised his glass. Then my work here is done. They toasted, not to victory, not to Genovese's downfall, just to survival. To another day alive in a world designed to kill men like them. Outside, the sun set over Harlem, gold and red and purple colors that didn't care about tribute or territory, or the quiet wars fought in counting rooms and diners. Bumpy Johnson sat in his usual booth, drinking his usual bourbon, alive, free, autonomous, the man who'd beaten Vito Genovese without firing a shot, the man who'd turned economics into violence and violence into obsolescence, the man who'd proven that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to an enemy isn't kill them. It's make them realize that killing you costs more than letting you live. 5 years later. That lesson still echoed. 20 years later, it would still echo. 50 years later, someone would write about it, make it legend, make it myth. But in that booth, in that moment, it was just truth. Hard, cold, undeniable. Power without a gun, the only kind that lasts. This story isn't here to celebrate criminals. It's here to show you how real power worked when the old rules still mattered. If you made it this far, you remember when men settled things with handshakes and strategy, not lawyers and publicity stunts. Bumpy Johnson understood what we've forgotten. That respect is earned through discipline, not demands. That a man who controls himself controls everything around him. That the smartest fight is the one you win without your opponent ever knowing there was a war. Subscribe if you want the stories they don't teach anymore. The ones about men who built empires on principle, not just profit. Like this if you believe character and cunning beat brute force every damn time. And tell us, in your years, what would you have done? Taken the insult and planned your move? Or let pride make the decision for you because the men who built this country knew something? Real power doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be final. More stories coming, the kind worth remembering.